One of my most popular books is The Super Freak, about a boy who discovers that he has a strange psychic power and decides to use it to become a criminal. I'd like to read a chapter. This is called The Artificial Kid. What if there was this giant American corporation that made robots? A really secret corporation making top secret test models for the US Army or the CIA. Robots that looked just like human beings. And what if this corporation made a robot of a kid? An artificial school kid. And maybe they wanted to see how well the robot would do if it was put into a class of regular kids, to see if the other kids noticed. It sounds a bit far-fetched, I know, but what if it were true? Ben Holly was 13 years old. He was in my class for French and science, and I was sure that he was a robot. He was a very good one, no doubt about that, very well made with highly advanced technology. He looked just like a human, and I don't think any of the other kids at school could tell that he was really a robot. They knew that there was something a little strange about him, and nobody played with him or talked to him much. He was an outsider, like me. But I could tell that he was artificial. I noticed little things about the way he moved and the way he spoke that gave it away. When he walked or moved his arms, every little movement was exact, just like a robot. He made one careful, precise movement after another, not like other kids who are usually just a big tangle of arms and legs all over the place. If you've ever seen one of those mechanical robotic arms working on a Japanese car factory assembly line, then you understand the sort of movements he made. If you walked behind him and listened really carefully, you could hear the pneumatics that powered his mechanical arms and legs, sort of a shing sound. Then there was the way his eyes moved. That was a dead giveaway. His eyes didn't flick around all over the place like normal kids' eyes. They stayed staring precisely on the same thing until he wanted to look at something else. Then they would move, very precisely, to focus on the new thing. Even the way he blinked was very exact and at perfectly timed intervals. I had a robot in my French class, and its name was Ben Holly. "Conjugate!" Führer Blüchner roared, and I hid a quick shiver before I joined in with the rest of the class. Conjugate is what you do when you're learning a foreign language. Your teacher gives you a word, and you have to give her all the other tenses of the word. In English, for example, if she said do, you'd say do, am doing, have done, have been doing, did, was doing, had done, have been doing, will do, will be doing, will have done, will have been doing, which covers just about all of the possibilities for do. Except this was French, and the word was parle, which means speak. Parle, parle, parler, parler, etc. I chanted in time with the rest of the class. Führer Blüchner was actually Mrs. Blüchner, but we all called her Führer Blüchner, not to her face though. She taught French and German, although she was actually Dutch. She was about 6 foot tall, 50 years old, and built like a Panzer tank with an attitude to match. When the Führer said conjugate, you conjugated. She scared the wits out of everyone at school, including, I'm sure, the other teachers. All the kids hated her, except, perversely, for me. I was a bit lazy at my schoolwork, I have to admit. If my homework was ever done on time, it was only because I'd stayed up past bedtime the night before, doing it all at the last minute. In class, I had a habit of losing concentration and staring out of the windows at birds whirling and wheeling over the rugby fields, or just staring at my watch until the period was over. I couldn't help it. I was easily bored. But in Führer Blüchner's class, I paid attention. Everybody paid attention. Führer Blüchner had a voice that could cut straight through sheet steel and disembowel you from 50 meters away. And if that didn't work, she had chalk. Chalk ends, to be exact. Little leftover bullets of chalk that were a bit too small for writing with, so she kept them in a box on her desk. The one time I had drifted off in Führer Blüchner's class, I had woken up with a smacking sound and a sudden stinging sensation on my face as a chalk bullet had caught me square on the cheek. She was a deadly accurate shot. A parent had once complained to Mr. Curtis, the principal, about the chalk. Mr. Curtis had invited the parent in for a conference with himself and Führer Blüchner. The story goes that the conference lasted no more than 5 minutes, after which both the parent and Mr. Curtis walked out white-faced, and the matter was closed. Nobody argued with a Panzer tank. The day she'd caught me, I'd been watching the birds and thinking about what it would be like to be able to fly, to go swooping over lakes and whirl around trees, to be light and free, going where you wanted, when you wanted, to be... That's when the chalk end got me, and it got me good. Care to join us? Führer Blüchner had asked in her thick Dutch accent. Sorry, Mrs. Blüchner, I had mumbled, and I'd never let myself lose attention in her class again. I always did my homework too for Führer Blüchner, and I put extra effort into my French assignments. Anything to avoid that lashing tongue or slashing chalk ends. Today, though, I was in trouble. We'd been given a French song to translate into English. Gentille Alouette. You may know it. Alouette, gentille Alouette. Alouette, je te plumerai. Alouette, gentille Alouette. Alouette, je te plumerai. Je te plumerai la tête. Je te plumerai la tête. Et la tête, et la tête. Alouette, alouette. Oh, it's all about plucking the feathers out of a bird. I'm not sure why you'd want to pluck the feathers out of a bird. It's just an old French folk song. Our homework was to translate the song into an English song, not just word for word, because that was pretty easy, but to make it rhyme and scan. The problem was, I'd been reading a really good book, and I'd put off doing my homework. Normally, as I said, I would never put off my French homework, but the book was really good. Eventually, I decided that the book was too exciting to put down and that I would get up early in the morning to do my homework. Good plan. The only problem was that I stayed up so late the night before reading that the next morning I slept in. Now I was sitting in Führer Blüchner's class, and it was very nearly the end of the period. I was praying that she wasn't going to pick on me to read out my song about plucking the feathers out of a bird. I didn't have a song. Her eyes roamed around the room and eventually settled on me, probably because of the guilty look on my face. Don't pick me, I thought desperately at her, the same way I had at Mr. Saltham in PE. Pick someone else. Don't pick me, don't pick me, don't pick me, don't pick me. Erica, Führer Blüchner said abruptly to the girl behind me. Stand up and read out your song. Now is probably a good time to tell you about Erica MacDonald. She wasn't all that tall, although she wasn't short, but she was the most extraordinarily beautiful creature I'd ever seen in my life. Erica was from Scotland, or at least her parents were. I don't know whether she'd been born there or after they'd emigrated, but she had a lovely, soft Scottish accent. Her hair was a kind of a sandy blonde colour and whispered softly past her ears. There was a warm, friendly smile, always on the verge of shining out from her eyes and her lips. She was smart, too, not like Jan Marks, who was almost as beautiful as Erica, but had a vacancy behind her eyes that went on forever. She sounds perfect, doesn't she? And she almost was. But Erica MacDonald was the ultimate ice queen. I mean, she was Frosty the Snow Girl. Those lips that looked ready to smile never did smile. Those perfect eyes never smiled either. She clearly thought she was a bit too good for the rest of us kids and kept to herself as much as she possibly could. She had a boyfriend, according to the school grapevine, a senior at Rossmany College. I'd had her in my class the whole year, and I don't think I'd spoken to her once, which was partly me, of course, but mostly her. She wouldn't speak to the likes of me if she could possibly help it, and yet I still had a crush on her in a it'll-never-happen kind of a way. Stand up and read out your song, said Führer Blüchner, and there was a moment's hesitation as Erica got to her feet. I found myself wondering why Führer Blüchner had not picked me. Could it possibly be that I had changed her mind? I was certain that she'd been staring directly at me, or had she been staring over my shoulder at Erica the whole time? Was it possible that somehow by projecting my thoughts as strongly as I could into Führer Blüchner's brain, that I had somehow implanted the thought into her mind? That seemed even more unlikely than my theory about Ben being a robot. And yet, when you thought about that time in PE... Erica finished and sat down behind me. There was silence from the other kids, and Fura Bluchner just nodded and said quietly, "All right," which was high praise from Fura Bluchner. It meant that she'd found nothing to criticize. The bell still hadn't gone for end of period, and the teacher manoeuvred her bulk around her desk to the blackboard and paused, thinking for a moment. More conjugation coming up, I thought, and wondered what word it would be. An odd thought popped into my mind, and I focused on Fura Bluchner's head and concentrated over and over on a single word. Knickers, I thought. There was no way Fura Bluchner was going to write knickers on the blackboard. It wasn't even a French word. So if she wrote knickers, then that would prove my unlikely theory. Knickers, 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 I thought. There was a cough from the back of the class, and her head snapped around, distracted by the sound. She reached down and absent-mindedly picked up a piece of chalk. Her hand moved slowly to the blackboard. As if in a daze, she slowly wrote a K, and then an N, followed by an I. Knickers, Fura Bluchner wrote on the blackboard as if it was a common French verb. She slammed the chalk down on the chalk tray and turned back to the class. "Conjugate," she said. Nobody said anything. I suspect they were all a bit surprised. And anyway, you can't conjugate an English noun in French, so nobody knew what to do. In another teacher's class there would have been muffled sniggering, but not in Fura Bluchner's. As for me, I was the most surprised of all, and more than a little bewildered at what had just happened. It seemed that I had somehow made Fura Bluchner write the word knickers on the blackboard just by thinking about it. "Conjugate!" Fura Bluchner roared, but still there was silence. Her face began to go red, a sure sign of an explosion building, but still nobody said anything. What was there to say? Her eyes flicked around the room, looking for a victim. They settled on her son. Fura Bluchner's son was named Marcus Bluchner, but we all called him Blocker. Yeah, that Blocker. Actually, I called him Blockhead, but not to his face. He'd beaten up kids for far less than that. He called me Freak to my face. Not that any of the teachers would know anything about that. As far as the teachers were concerned, he was a hero, the star of the school rugby league team, a try-scoring prop forward, a polite and gentle giant. Teachers can be so blind. The reality is that he was a big, heavy, strong, merciless bully. Blocker got no special treatment in his mother's French class. In fact, I suspected he got a harder time than most, just to show us or show him that he was getting no favours. So it was no surprise that she picked on him to conjugate the word. Unfortunately for Blocker, the word was not conjugatable. But Blocker began, trying desperately to figure a way out of this one. "I didn't ask for buts. I asked you to conjugate," the teacher roared. I wondered if she was like that at home. It might explain a bit about Blocker, I thought, if that were true. Blocker was still silent. "Conjugate!" Eventually he stuttered. "Knickers, nickons, nickay, nickont." The rest of the class froze. You know that feeling when you desperately want to burst into giggles, but you dare not? Jenny Chrysler, sitting to my right, clapped both hands over her mouth. I suppose I was the only one who wasn't inwardly cracking up with laughter. I was too flabbergasted. Ben, the robot, a few seats in front of me, had no such constraint. He was actually shaking as he struggled to hold in his laughter. I guess his humour circuits were getting overloaded. Fura Bluchner, Blocker's mother, went purple. Blocker didn't stop. He was just trying to do his best. Even getting it wrong was preferable to not trying, I suppose. "Nikkei, Nikkei, Nikkion, Nikkie," he continued. The volcano was building, and I braced myself for the eruption when all of a sudden Fura Bluchner turned and looked at the board, and all the steam went out of her, as if someone had popped a release valve. "Who wrote—" she started to say, but stopped, because she knew that it was her. She stood there for a while, shaking her head slowly, uncomprehendingly. Then she marched to the blackboard and scraped the offending word off with a duster before writing up naître, to be born. At that point, two things happened. The bell went for the end of class, and Ben Holly erupted into a fit of giggles. His programmers needed to work on that. Fuhrer Blüchner turned and glared at him, but unusually said and did nothing. Ben was just about falling out of his chair, and that set the rest of the class off. Most of them tried to contain it until they were safely clear of the danger zone that was the French class. Then they burst into uncontrollable laughter. Not Blocker, though. The evil eye that he gave little Ben Holly was enough to slice through flesh and bone. Most of the class had been laughing, but Ben had started it, and I knew that he was in for a beating at lunchtime. I hoped it wouldn't damage any of his circuits. I'm still not sure what made Blocker so malevolent just then. Was it because he thought Ben was laughing at him, or was it because he thought Ben was laughing at his mother? Either way, Ben Holly was in for a hiding, and I was in for a lot of thinking.